What happens when an old cowboy, notorious for his sour temper and love for whiskey, stumbles across a dying horse in the mountains? Why does this one moment spark a chain of events that flips his life upside down and sets an entire town buzzing? And how do absurd coincidences, bitter irony, and stubborn grit tangle into a single wild drama? Here's how it all kicked off. Hey there, listener. How's it going, and where you tuning in from? The sun hung high over the canyon, baking the earth like a skillet left too long on the fire. Jack Ramsey, a grizzled cowboy pushing 50, trudged along the narrow trail, his boots kicking up clouds of dust that clung to his sweat-soaked shirt. His horse had died 2 days back, leaving him to curse his luck and the ache in his knees with every step. He muttered to himself about the botched cattle deal in Redstone, where a slick-talking buyer had cheated him out of half his pay. Life, Jack figured, was just a long string of bad hands dealt by a crooked dealer. He squinted against the glare, wiping his brow with a bandana that had seen better days. The canyon stretched out endless, all jagged rocks and scrubby bushes that looked as tired as he felt. Jack's flask, tucked in his vest, was down to its last lukewarm swallow of whiskey, and even that tasted more like regret than relief. He'd been riding, or walking now, for 30 years, chasing deals, dodging bullets, and outrunning promises. What did he have to show for it? A bad back, a worse temper, and a reputation for being meaner than a cornered rattlesnake? Halfway through the canyon, something caught his eye, a shadow under a boulder, just off the trail. At first, he thought it was a trick of the heat, the way it shimmered and warped the air. But as he got closer, he saw it, a horse, sprawled in the dirt, its ribs heaving like it was fighting for every breath. Its coat was matted, its eyes half closed, and flies buzzed around a gash on its flank. Jack stopped, his boots scuffing the ground. He'd seen plenty of dying animals in his time. Cattle, dogs, even men. Walking away was easier, smarter. Damn fool thing lying there like that, he grumbled, spitting into the dust. He adjusted his hat, ready to move on. His knees screamed, his flask was near empty, and he had no business playing savior, but something held him there, rooted like a stubborn weed. Maybe it was the way the horse's eyes flicked toward him, not begging, just watching. Or maybe it was the heat addling his brain. Either way, Jack Ramsey, the man who'd once told a preacher to shove his sermons where the sun didn't shine, found himself standing still, staring at a creature that looked as broken as he felt. He took a step closer, against every ounce of his better judgment, and "Ain't got time for this nonsense," he muttered, but his hand was already reaching for the canteen slung over his shoulder. He didn't know why he cared, and that irritated him more than the heat, or the dust, or the deal gone sour. Jack Ramsey wasn't a man who stopped for strays, human or otherwise. Yet here he was, kneeling in the dirt, cussing under his breath as he poured water into his palm for a horse that might not even make it through the hour. Jack Ramsey knelt in the canyon's dirt, his knees creaking louder than the saddle he'd sold off last winter. The horse, a scrawny bay with a gash oozing blood, stared at him with eyes that seemed to say it knew this was a fool's errand. Jack poured more water from his canteen, splashing it over the wound, which looked worse up close, deep, crusted with dirt, and smelling like trouble. He cursed himself for stopping, for caring, for wasting water he'd need to reach town. "You're a sorry sight, ain't you?" he said to the horse, his voice rough as gravel. "Reckon you're too dumb to quit, just like me." He tore a strip from his already tattered shirt, wrapping it around the gash as best he could. The horse flinched, but didn't fight, too weak to do much but twitch its ears. Jack's hands, calloused from years of rope and reins, worked clumsily, like he was trying to fix a busted clock with a hammer. "Don't get ideas," he muttered, tying the cloth tight. "I ain't no saint. Just don't want your stink haunting me down the trail." The words felt hollow, even to him. He wasn't sure who he was trying to convince, the horse or himself. As he worked, Jack's mind wandered to the absurdity of it all. He'd dodged bullets, outrun posses, and once stared down a grizzly with nothing but a knife and a bad attitude. Yet here he was, playing nursemaid to a half-dead nag in the middle of nowhere. "If the boys in Redstone could see this," he chuckled darkly, "they'd laugh me out of the saloon." The horse snorted like it agreed, and Jack shot at a glare. "Don't you start, you mangy critter." He sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his brow. The heat pressed down, relentless, but something else stirred in him, a tug like a hook caught in his chest. He'd spent years running from attachments, debts, anything that smelled like responsibility, but this horse, this broken thing, had no one else. Neither did Jack, if he was honest. He shook his head, muttering, "This is dumber than betting on a one-legged mule." Yet, when he stood, he didn't walk away. Instead, he looped his rope around the horse's neck, coaxing it to its feet with a mix of curses and patience he didn't know he had. Jack Ramsey trudged into Redstone at dusk, the horse limping behind him on a makeshift lead. The town's main street was a dusty strip of saloons, a general store, and a jail that looked more decorative than functional. He'd tied the horse outside the livery, its bandaged flank drawing curious glances from passers-by. Jack's own shirt, now missing a sleeve, hung like a badge of his questionable decisions. He ignored the stares, his jaw set tight, and pushed through the bat-wing doors of the Rusty Spur Saloon, where the air smelled of stale beer and broken promises. Inside, the usual crowd of drifters and ranch hands leaned over tables, their laughter dying as Jack walked in. "Well, look who's back," called Pete, a gap-toothed barfly with a knack for trouble. "Heard you got fleeced on that cattle deal, Ramsey. Now what, you moonlightin' as a horse doctor?" The room erupted in snickers, and Jack felt every eye on him like a brand. He slid onto a stool, signaling for a whiskey. "Mind your own, Pete," he said, his voice low but sharp. "Unless you want my boot, mindin' your teeth." The bartender, a wiry man named Amos, slid a glass across the counter. "Folks say you spent half the day nursing some half-dead nag," he said, smirking. "What's next, Jack? Knitting blankets for orphans?" The laughter swelled again, and Jack's grip tightened on his glass. He'd heard worse in his time. Hell, he'd said worse. But the jabs stung more than he cared to admit. He tossed back the whiskey, letting the burn drown out the noise. "Y'all got too much time and not enough brains," he shot back, but the words lacked their usual bite. He stared into his empty glass, the saloon's chatter fading to a dull hum. Jack wasn't one for soul-searching. Introspection was for poets and fools. But the horse, the canyon, the whole damn day gnawed at him. Why'd he stop? Why'd he care? The townsfolk's mockery echoed his own doubts, each laugh a reminder of the man he'd become, a loner, a grumbler, a punchline. He ordered another drink, but it tasted like ash. The horse was alive for now, but Jack felt the weight of every choice he'd made to get here. Alone, broke, and now apparently the town's newest joke. The saloon's clamor faded as Jack Ramsey stepped onto Redstone's main street, the night air sharp with the scent of dust and distant rain. He'd left the Rusty Spur after one too many jabs, his mood sourer than the whiskey he'd downed. The town felt different now, edgier, like it was holding its breath. As he walked toward the livery to check on the horse, he noticed 3 figures lounging by the general store, their silhouettes lit by the flicker of a lantern. Jack's gut tightened. He knew those slouched hats and low-slung holsters. The Carver brothers, a trio of no-good raiders, had rolled into town. Years back, Jack had crossed paths with them in a poker game gone bad. He'd called out their cheating, left their eldest, Nate, with a busted nose, and walked away with their winnings. Now, Nate Carver's eyes locked onto Jack from across the street, his smirk sharp as a blade. "Well, if it ain't the horse whisperer," Nate drawled, stepping forward. "Heard you're saving strays now, Ramsey. Gone soft." His brothers chuckled, their hands resting too casually on their gun belts. Jack stopped, his boots planted firm in the dirt. "Only thing soft's your head, Nate," he said, his voice steady but laced with venom. "You boys here to rob the bank or just scare the chickens?" The brothers' laughter died and Nate's face hardened. "Keep talking, old man," he said. "We're settling scores soon enough." The threat hung heavy, but Jack didn't flinch. He'd faced worse odds and walked away. Still, his hand brushed the revolver at his hip, a habit from years of staying alive. Down the street, the sheriff's office was dark, its occupant likely resting at the bordello. Redstone's lawman had a knack for vanishing when trouble brewed, leaving folks to fend for themselves. Jack knew the Carvers weren't just passing through, they'd come to stir up hell, and he'd just painted a target on his back. He turned toward the livery, his steps deliberate, but Nate's voice followed him. "Sleep light, Ramsey. We ain't done." Jack didn't reply, but his mind churned. He'd spent years dodging old grudges, but this one had found him right when he was already wrestling with his own fool choices. The horse, the town, the Carvers. It was all piling up, and Jack Ramsey wasn't sure he had enough fight left to deal with it. The rusty spur was a powder keg by sundown, its air thick with smoke and the tang of spilled beer. Jack Ramsey had gone back inside, figuring another whiskey might dull the sting of Nate Carver's threats. He was halfway through his second glass when the batwing doors swung open and the Carver brothers stormed in, their boots thudding like a war drum. The saloon hushed, every eye darting between the trio and Jack, who sat at the bar looking more annoyed than alarmed. Nate, the eldest, pointed a gloved finger. "Time's up, Ramsey," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "You owe us a reckoning." Jack set his glass down, slow and deliberate. "Reckoning for what? Your lousy poker face," he said, his dry tone drawing a few nervous chuckles from the crowd. Nate's face reddened, and before Jack could blink, a chair sailed across the room, crashing into a table. The saloon erupted into chaos. Men scrambled, glasses shattered, and someone's fist connected with someone else's jaw. Jack ducked a wild swing from one of Nate's brothers, only to catch a stray elbow in the ribs. He stumbled, cursing, and grabbed a stool to swing back, more out of instinct than heroism. The brawl was less a fight than a drunken circus. A ranch hand tripped over a spittoon, sending it flying into Nate's shin, who howled and swung at the wrong man. Jack, dodging a bottle, tossed a barbed insult about Nate's aim that got half the room laughing. But his ribs ached and a cut above his eye stung with sweat. He wasn't winning, but he wasn't down yet. When Nate lunged, Jack sidestepped, letting the man crash into a card table, sending cards and coins scattering. The crowd roared, and for a moment Jack's sarcasm felt like the sharpest weapon in the room. By the time the dust settled, the Carvers were bruised and limping out, swearing revenge. Jack stood, panting, his shirt torn and a fresh bruise blooming on his cheek. The saloon patrons stared, some grinning, others shaking their heads. "Didn't know you had that in you, Ramsey," Amos the bartender said, tossing him a rag for the blood. Jack wiped his face, muttering, "Neither did I." The town was starting to see him differently, not as a washed-up grump, but as a man who could still throw a punch and a quip. He didn't feel heroic, just sore, but the shift in their eyes was impossible to miss. The morning sun was a harsh judge, glaring down on Jack Ramsey as he saddled the bay horse he'd nursed back to life. The animal, still lean but steadier now, snorted as Jack tightened the cinch, his hands stiff from the saloon brawl. Word had spread through Redstone like wildfire. The Carver brothers wanted blood, and they'd left a message scrawled in the dust outside the livery. "Meet us at Blackthorn Ridge, Ramsey, or we burn the town." Jack's jaw clenched as he read it, his bruised ribs throbbing with every breath. He didn't owe Redstone a damn thing, but the thought of those lowlifes torching the place made his blood boil. He rode out alone, the horse's hooves kicking up dust as they climbed toward the ridge, a jagged scar of rock and scrub overlooking the valley. Jack's mind churned with every step. "Stupid," he muttered to the horse, his voice rough. "Shoulda let you die back there and save myself this mess." The bay flicked an ear, unbothered as if it knew better. Jack's flask was empty now, and the weight of his revolver felt heavier than usual. He wasn't a hero, just a fool with a knack for bad choices and worse enemies. At Blackthorn Ridge, the Carvers waited, three shadows against the noon sky. Nate stood center, his brothers flanking him, their rifles glinting. "Thought you'd run, Ramsey," Nate called, his smirk twisting like a knife. Jack eased off the horse, his boots hitting the ground with a dull thud. "Thought about it," he said, his tone dry as the canyon, "but I figured you'd miss my charming company." The brothers didn't laugh. Nate spat into the dirt. "You're done, old man. No saloon crowd to save you now." Jack's eyes scanned the ridge. Boulders, a dry creek bed, a few stunted trees. He'd faced worse odds, but not by much. His mouth opened before he could stop it. "You boys ever think about bathing before a fight? Smells liable to kill me first." Nate's face darkened and a rifle shot cracked, kicking up dust near Jack's feet. He didn't flinch, but his heart pounded. The horse shifted behind him, and Jack's hand hovered near his gun. He wasn't fast like he used to be, but he was cunning, and this ridge was his only ally. The standoff stretched, taut as a rope. Jack's mind raced, piecing together a plan. Use the rocks, draw their fire, maybe outsmart them. He didn't want to die here, not for a town that laughed at him, not for a horse that shouldn't matter, but something stubborn in him, the same thing that made him stop for that damn animal, wouldn't let him back down. "Let's get this over with," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. The Carvers raised their rifles, and Jack braced himself, knowing this fight wasn't about glory. It was about settling a debt he didn't fully understand. The first shot rang out, splitting the silence of Blackthorn Ridge like a thunderclap. Jack Ramsey dove behind a boulder, his shoulder slamming into the rock as a bullet whizzed past, chipping stone. The Carver brothers spread out, their boots crunching gravel, trying to flank him. Jack's heart hammered, but his hands were steady, drawing his revolver with the ease of a man who'd done it 1,000 times. "You boys shoot like you play cards," he shouted, his voice carrying over the ridge. "All bluff, no aim." Nate's curse was drowned by another shot, this one grazing the boulder's edge. Jack scrambled to a dry creek bed, using the shallow dip for cover. The bay horse, tied to a scrub tree, snorted nervously, but held its ground. Jack's eyes darted, mapping the terrain, rocks to his left, a steep drop to his right, and the Carvers closing in. He fired twice, not aiming to kill but to rattle them, forcing Nate's younger brother to duck behind a stump. "That's it, hide like a jackrabbit," Jack taunted, buying time. He wasn't young or fast, but he knew how to make men second-guess themselves. Nate's voice boomed from above. "You're trapped, Ramsey. Might as well beg." Jack grinned, despite the sweat stinging his eyes. He grabbed a fist-sized rock, chucking it hard into a nearby bush. The rustle drew a wild shot from the youngest Carver, exposing his position. Jack fired, clipping the man's arm, and the yelp echoed off the canyon walls. One down, sort of, but a sharp pain tore through Jack's side. A bullet had grazed him, blood soaking his torn shirt. He bit back a curse, muttering, "Hell of a day to die sober." Using the creek bed, Jack crawled to a new position, his breath ragged. The Carvers were cautious now, their shots less reckless. He needed them rattled, so he shouted, "Nate, your ma know you're still this bad at shooting?" The insult worked. Nate charged forward, firing blindly. Jack rolled out, snapping off a shot that caught Nate in the leg. The man stumbled, howling, and Jack seized the moment, sprinting to a larger boulder. His side burned, his vision blurred, but he kept moving, driven by a stubbornness that felt like a curse. The canyon's dust choked the air, and Jack knew this fight wasn't over, but he'd be damned if he went down without making the Carvers regret crossing him. The canyon air was thick with dust and gun smoke, the kind that burned your throat and blurred your eyes. Jack Ramsey crouched behind a jagged boulder, his side screaming where the bullet had grazed him, blood seeping through his fingers as he pressed his torn shirt against the wound. The Carver brothers were still out there, 2 of them anyway. Nate, limping but furious, and his middle brother, who'd taken to cursing louder than a preacher at a revival. The youngest was slumped against a rock, clutching his arm, out of the fight. Jack's revolver had 3 rounds left, and his breath came in short, ragged bursts. He wasn't sure if he was winning or just delaying the inevitable. "Give it up, Ramsey," Nate's voice echoed, raw with pain but still venomous. "You're bleeding out like a stuck pig." Jack's lips twitched into a grim smile. He remembered the saloon, the laughter, the jeers about the horse, about him being a washed-up fool. Those voices lit a fire in him now, hotter than the pain in his side. "Takes one to know one, Nate," he shouted back, his voice steady despite the ache. He shifted, peering around the boulder, and saw Nate hobbling toward a cluster of rocks, rifle in hand. Jack's mind flashed to the horse, still tied to that scrub tree, its ears pricked like it sensed the chaos. He'd saved that damn animal for no good reason, and now here he was, bleeding in a canyon for the same kind of stubborn nonsense. But then the horse did something Jack didn't expect. It yanked free of the rope, charging toward Nate with a wild snort. The sudden movement startled Nate, who stumbled, his shot going wide. Jack seized the chance, firing twice. One bullet clipped Nate's shoulder, sending him sprawling. The other missed, but it didn't matter. The horse had given Jack the edge he needed. He staggered to his feet, ignoring the fire in his side, and ran toward Nate, who was scrambling for his rifle. Jack kicked it away, leveling his gun at the man's chest. "Stay down, or I'll make sure you don't get up," he growled, his voice more exhausted than triumphant. Nate glared but didn't move. The middle brother, seeing his leader down, threw up his hands, muttering curses. The fight was over, and the canyon fell quiet, save for the horse's heavy breathing and Jack's own labored gasps. He glanced at the bay, now standing calm as if it hadn't just turned the tide. "You're a damn nuisance," he muttered to it, almost fond. His stubbornness had cost him blood, but it, and the horse, had kept him alive. Jack Ramsey limped back into Redstone, the bay horse trailing behind him, its hooves kicking up dust that shimmered in the fading light. His side was bandaged with another strip of his ruined shirt, the wound still throbbing but no longer bleeding. The town's main street was quiet, save for a few curious faces peeking from windows or lingering on porches. Word of the Blackthorn Ridge fight had spread faster than a brush fire, carried by a ranch hand who'd seen Jack ride out. No one laughed now as he passed the rusty spur, his boots scuffing the dirt with a stubborn rhythm. Inside the saloon, the air felt different. No jeers, no smirks, just a heavy silence as Jack pushed through the bat-wing doors. Amos, the bartender, froze mid-wipe of a glass, his eyes wide. "Heard you took on the Carvers, Ramsey," he said, his voice low with something like awe. "All three, alone." Jack shrugged, wincing as the motion tugged his wound. "Wasn't alone," he muttered, jerking a thumb toward the horse tied outside. "That damn nag's got more fight than half this town." A few patrons chuckled, but it wasn't mocking. It was the kind of laugh that carried respect. He slid onto a stool, and Amos set a whiskey in front of him, without being asked. Jack stared at it, the amber liquid catching the lantern light. He'd spent years drowning his failures in glasses like this, but tonight it felt unnecessary. The crowd's eyes were on him, not as the town grump, but as something else, a man who'd faced down death and walked away. Pete, the gap-toothed barfly, leaned over, his usual smirk gone. "Never thought you'd be the one to stand up to those bastards, Jack," he said. "Took guts." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Guts or stupidity? Pick one." The room laughed again, warmer this time. As he sipped the whiskey, Jack felt the weight of their gazes shift something in him. He'd never cared for their opinions before, never wanted to be their hero. Yet here he was, the same man who'd grumbled about a dying horse, now the talk of Redstone. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd stumbled into this mess by accident, driven by a choice he still didn't fully understand. The horse, the fight, the blood. It all added up to a story bigger than he'd meant to write. He glanced out the window at the bay, now munching hay like nothing had happened. "You and me, we're both fools," he muttered under his breath, but a faint smile tugged at his lips. For the first time in years, Jack Ramsey didn't feel like he was just passing through. Jack Ramsey sat at the bar of the Rusty Spur, the whiskey in his hand untouched, a rare sight for a man who'd once called it his only friend. The saloon was packed, the air buzzing with voices retelling the Blackthorn Ridge fight like it was already a tall tale. Lanterns cast flickering shadows on the walls, and Jack's bruised face caught the light, making him look older, wearier, but somehow sharper. He leaned back, his side still aching from the graze, and let the crowd's chatter wash over him. For once, he didn't mind the attention, not much anyway. "Tell it, Ramsey," called a ranch hand from a corner table, his grin wide enough to show missing teeth. "How'd you outsmart those Carvers?" Jack's eyes narrowed, but a smirk tugged at his lips. He stood, slow and deliberate, and the room hushed. "Ain't much to tell," he said, his voice rough but carrying. "3 idiots thought they could scare me. Forgot I'm too stubborn to die." Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Jack paused, letting it sink in. "Truth is, I had help. That horse out there's got more sense than all of them combined." The room erupted, some laughing, others wiping their eyes, caught by the absurdity and grit of it all. Jack spun the tale, leaning into the humor, how he'd taunted Nate Carver's aim, how the horse had charged like it was settling its own score. He didn't mention the blood, the fear, or the moment he thought he'd lose. Instead, he painted it as a farce, a dusty comedy of errors where he'd stumbled into victory. "And when Nate went down," he said, pausing for effect, "I told him he'd have better luck cheating at cards than shooting at me." The crowd roared, and even Amos, pouring drinks, shook his head with a grin. Jack sat back down, his story done, but the weight of it lingered. These folks weren't just laughing, they were listening, hanging on his words like he was more than a washed-up cowboy. He'd spent years dodging their respect, their pity, their anything, but now he saw it in their eyes. He'd given them something to believe in. The irony hit him like a kick. His whole life, he'd mocked heroes, yet here he was, playing one in a saloon full of drunks and dreamers. He glanced at the horse through the window, its silhouette calm against the moonlight. "We're both idiots," he muttered, but the words carried a warmth he hadn't felt in years. The laughter around him wasn't just at his story, it was a bridge, tying him to a town he'd never meant to call home. Jack Ramsey leaned against the hitching post outside the Rusty Spur, the night air cool against his bruised face. The saloon's laughter still echoed in his ears, but the quiet of Redstone's main street brought a different kind of weight. His side ached where the bullet had grazed him, and the bay horse, tied nearby, munched hay like it hadn't just saved his life. Jack's fingers traced the revolver at his hip, a habit born from years of looking over his shoulder. He'd won the fight, earned the town's respect, but something told him the story wasn't over. A shadow moved near the general store, and Jack tensed, his hand tightening on the gun. It was the youngest Carver, the one he'd clipped in the arm at Blackthorn Ridge. The kid's face was pale, his arm slung in a makeshift bandage, but his eyes burned with a hate that made Jack's gut twist. "You think you're done, Ramsey?" The kid spat, his voice low but sharp. "Nate's alive, and he don't forget. We'll be back, and you'll wish you'd stayed in that canyon." Jack kept his gaze steady, his voice dry as dust. "Tell Nate to practice his aim first. Might help next time." The kid sneered but slipped back into the dark, leaving Jack alone with the crickets and his thoughts. He turned to the horse, patting its neck, more to steady himself than the animal. The Carvers weren't the first grudge he'd earned, and they wouldn't be the last. He'd spent his life running from men like them. Cheats, thieves, killers, each one a reminder of the choices that had carved him into the man he was. Saving that horse, fighting those brothers, it all felt like a detour from the lonely road he'd chosen long ago. Yet standing here, with the town's newfound respect still warm in his chest, Jack wondered if he'd been running towards something without knowing it. The threat lingered like smoke curling around his thoughts. Redstone might call him a hero now, but heroes didn't last long out here, not with men like the Carvers waiting for a chance to settle scores. Jack's smirk faded as he looked down the empty street, the lantern light casting long shadows. He'd never been one for settling down, for roots or promises, but this town, this horse, this fight, they'd tethered him in a way he couldn't shake. "Ain't no end to this, is there?" he muttered to the horse, his voice heavy with the truth. He'd face more fights, more blood, more nights like this, because that's what it meant to be Jack Ramsey, part hero, part fool, and always too stubborn to quit. Jack Ramsey walked the trail out of Redstone, the morning sun already scorching the earth, turning the dust to a fine haze. The bay horse plodded beside him, its strength returned, its coat gleaming despite the dirt. Jack's side still ached, the bandage stiff with dried blood, but he moved with a stubborn rhythm, his boots scuffing the ground. He grumbled about his creaking knees, the empty flask in his vest, the whole damn world that never let him rest. Yet for all his complaints, there was a lightness in his step he hadn't felt in years. The town was behind him now, its wooden storefronts fading into the horizon. Redstone had stopped laughing at him, but Jack knew better than to call it home. The Carver kid's threat echoed in his mind. More trouble was coming, same as always. He'd spent 30 years dodging grudges, outrunning debts, and out-talking trouble. This time, though, something had shifted. That horse, the one he'd half expected to die in the canyon, was proof he'd done something right for once. "You're a damn nuisance," he said to the bay, his voice gruff but warm. The horse snorted like it was calling him out. Jack's hand rested on the reins, his eyes scanning the endless stretch of rock and scrub. He'd never been one for big lessons, but the past week had taught him something. Maybe miracles weren't angels or lightning bolts, but choices you didn't plan on making. Saving that horse, facing the Carvers, taking the town's respect, it all came from the same stubborn streak that kept him alive. He chuckled, shaking his head. "Tragedy and a damn circus, all in one," he muttered, the irony thick enough to choke on. As the trail curved toward the mountains, Jack glanced at the horse, then back at the road ahead. He'd keep moving because that's what he did. The Carvers might come back or they might not, but he'd be ready, same as he'd been ready for every other fight. "Here's how it went," he said to the empty air, his voice low and dry. "Or close enough." The horse flicked an ear, and Jack's smirk returned. The dust settled behind them, the road stretched on, and Jack Ramsey, part hero, part fool, walked into the next chapter of a life that was never quite what he expected.